I think after the injuries and the struggles the Orioles lineup had down the stretch last year, their big motto of this offseason has been there is no such thing as too much depth. And that continued on Tuesday with the Orioles signing Ramón Laureano to a one-year deal. I'll break down how the veteran outfielder helps the Orioles in 2025 coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're talking about another Orioles Major League signing. This time, it is veteran outfielder Ramón Laureano, who the Orioles have brought in on a one-year, $4 million deal, first reported by Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic on Tuesday afternoon. The deal also includes a club option that the Orioles could pick up to pay Laureano $6.5 million for the 2026 season as well. Going to break down the deal from all angles. How could he help the Orioles? What kind of player has he been in his career? What kind of player is he now? What are the flaws in Laureano's game? And how does this fit in the Orioles roster? And what does this mean for potentially future moves still to come this offseason? But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So let's talk about Ramón Laureano. Orioles bringing him in on a one-year, $4 million deal on Tuesday. They end up giving him a potential club option for 2026 as well that would be worth $6.5 million. Probably not a great chance that option is eventually picked up, even if Laureano is still an Oriole. But let's talk about it. Why did the Orioles sign Ramón Laureano? It feels like they've signed a lot of outfielders already this offseason. So let's start with kind of the scouting report on Laureano, who he is, and how this signing could work out well for the Orioles. Well, Ramón Laureano is a 30-year-old right-handed hitting outfielder who was first drafted by, I'm going to give you a second to guess which team under which regime originally drafted Ramón Laureano. Here's your second. Think about it. Yell out your answers. Yes, it was the Houston Astros back in 2014 when Mike Elias was the scouting director in Houston. The O's have brought in a lot of players like that over the past couple of years that Elias originally drafted in Houston. Ramón Laureano is just another one to add to the list. A 16th round selection by the Astros in 2014 out of a college that sounds like it is straight out of the East-West Bowl skit on Key and Peele. That is Northeastern Oklahoma A&M College. That combined the names of three colleges into one college. It is a junior college in Oklahoma that Ramón Laureano played for. I would call him probably the second most famous athlete from, what was it again? Northeastern Oklahoma A&M College. Jeremy Shockey apparently played there for a year. I would call him at least a little bit more famous as an athlete than Ramón Laureano. But the Astros found this guy, and what a find this was in the 16th round out of an obscure junior college, because he was coming up through the Astros system, was looking like a pretty solid player, not a all-star top prospect type guy, but he was looking like he could be a contributor for Houston. He got up to Double-A and was okay there in 2017 after really being good at the end of the year in Double-A in 2016. But then he became eligible for the Rule 5 draft, and the Astros decided they did not have room to keep him on their 40-man roster and offer him a spot. So instead, they traded him in November of 2017 to the Oakland Athletics as one of those 40-man roster crunch deals. Funny enough, right-handed pitcher Brandon Bailey went back to Houston in that deal. Bailey later in his career was actually an Orioles Rule 5 pick who never pitched for the Orioles, and then was a pitching coach in the FCL for the Orioles in the 2024 season. He has since been hired away by the Dodgers to be a pitching coach in their system this year, but kind of funny Orioles connection even with Brandon Bailey, the guy he was traded for. But Laureano goes to Oakland lights it up in the first half of the season in his AAA debut with the Athletics and gets the call to the major leagues at the end of 2018. And he was good. He hit 288, had a 131 WRC plus in 48 games down the stretch with the A's in 2018 at age 23. He looked like more than just a fourth outfielder. He looked like a guy who could really, really help the Athletics. Now, he had a bit of a stress reaction in his leg in 2019 that caused him to miss a little more than a month. But when he was on the field, he was really good again in 2019, played 123 games for Oakland, hit 288 again, 521 slugging, 24 home runs, had a 127 WRC plus. He was worth 3.8 wins, according to Fangraphs, had a fantastic kind of breakout first full season in the big leagues in 2019. And then he was one of those guys where the COVID season did not do him any favors. Now, he stayed healthy. He played 54 games for Oakland in 2020, but his average dropped from 288 to 213, basically became more of a league average hitter, league average defender, was not worth nearly as much that season. Now, he rebounded in 2021, first 88 games of the season, had a 112 WRC plus, looked closer to the hitter he was early in his career, and then the suspension struck. He was handed down an 80-game suspension by Major League Baseball in August of 2021 for testing positive for PEDs. The drug was a steroid called nandrolone that they found in him. Now, Laureano claimed it entered his body by accident. He didn't take it purposefully. It was through something else, another supplement he was taking that he thought was approved, actually had this steroid in it. He said it was just trace amounts. He apologized, and he missed the rest of that 2021 season. Also had to miss the first 27 games of 2022 as he was suspended to carry out those 80 games. And when he came back, that is when he started to struggle at the plate. Now, he had a couple of injuries in 2022 as well, but just was not the same player. 94 WRC plus that year in the 94 games he played in. Then in 2023, started out even worse with Oakland, was not hitting at all in the first 64 games. And he was DFA'd by the A's in August and claimed off waivers by the Cleveland Guardians, who are always looking for outfielders who can even do a semblance of hitting the baseball. So Laureano goes to Cleveland, and he was much better down the stretch with the Guardians. 41 games, was an above league average hitter, looked a little bit more like himself. So Cleveland keeps him around and gives him a spot for 2024, and he's never looked worse. 31 games with the Guardians to start last season. He hit 143, struck out 39% of the time, and posted a 51 WRC plus. He was horrendous. And even the Cleveland Guardians, who struggle to find outfielders that can do anything offensively, just released Ramón Laureano because he was unplayable at that point. But, he was not old. He was only just not even turned 30 yet. He had success in the past. And the Atlanta Braves, who saw Ronald Acuna Jr. suffer another injury and were getting injured left and right, they needed some healthy bodies. And so the Braves signed Ramón Laureano, and they called him up in mid-June to join the Major League roster. And from there, he looked like the old Laureano. With the Braves, he played in 67 games down the stretch. He was not an everyday player, but he was in there a lot. 226 plate appearances. Laureano hit 296, career best average, 327 on base, 505 slugging, with 10 home runs, good for a 129 WRC plus. He was 29% better than league average as a hitter in those 67 games with Atlanta. Kind of helped will that injured Braves team somehow into the postseason last year. Ramón Laureano, you can't deny, was a big part of the Braves staying afloat despite all of their injuries. So he went into the offseason and he was still under contract. He was set to make somewhere between $6 and $7 million in arbitration. Seemed like a fair price for a guy that really helped the Braves last year, but Atlanta was getting healthy, right? They were getting a fully healthy Michael Harris and hopefully Ronald Acuna Jr. back, and they were looking to add to their outfield. They eventually did by signing Jurickson Profar to play left field. So you could see that Atlanta didn't have maybe the same role for him as they did when they were so injured, and they decided not to pay him that money. They non-tendered Ramón Laureano, making him a free agent earlier than he would have thought. So Laureano hit the market, and you're thinking, hey, he had that good year with Atlanta, kind of a resurgent year. Someone's going to give him a major league deal and guarantee him, even if it's a bad team, guarantee him a starting spot in the outfield off of what he did last year. But apparently that never happened. And it is somewhat surprising. He settled for a 1-year, $4 million deal with an Orioles team that absolutely cannot guarantee him a starting outfield spot. And we'll talk about later what exactly his role will be in Baltimore. But maybe 1 year, $4 million with a good team in the O's was the best deal that he got. So how will this work for the Orioles if it does work out well? Well, I mean, in those 67 games with the Braves, he was equal to his early success in Oakland. He hit 300 against fastballs last year, so you can tell his bat speed was still good. He's not losing it. 12.6% barrel rate for Laureano last year. That's pretty elite for a hitter who's not like a dominant everyday guy. And he was, again, hitting lefties very well. And that has kind of been the theme of the depth bats, really all the bats the Orioles have brought in this offseason. They are looking to get much better against left-handed pitching. And Ramón Laureano continues that for this season. A career 123 WRC plus against lefties is good enough, but it was up to 139 in 2024, and that includes all the struggles he had with Cleveland. If you just break it off to say his time with the Braves when he was really good. Now, he only had 66 plate appearances against lefties with Atlanta, so not a huge sample size. But in those 68 plate appearances against left-handed pitching, Ramón Laureano hit 377 with a 424 on base and a 639 slugging, good for a 193 WRC plus. He was almost twice as good as the average big league hitter when he was a Brave last year against lefties. From June 1st to the end of the year, that was right around when the Braves called him up for the first time, he was the 13th best hitter in Major League Baseball against left-handed pitching for the final 4 months of the season. Now, those are some parameters, but that is still pretty impressive if he can carve out a at least platoon role for your team. And you have to think that is what the Orioles love to see, because they've already had this offseason where they've added Tyler O'Neill, Gary Sanchez, Dylan Carlson, Daz Cameron, all guys who hit lefties well. And Laureano falls into that mix. And defensively, he's a guy who has played all three outfield positions at the big league level, so he gives you versatility. He's not the greatest outfielder overall, and we'll get to that. But you've probably seen some defensive highlights from Ramón Laureano in your lifetime, and that is because he has one of the strongest and best outfield arms in all of Major League Baseball. Just look up Ramón Laureano defensive highlights on YouTube. You'll see some incredible throws. He was still, in 2024, ranked number one in baseball in StatCast's arm value metric that takes into account your arm strength and your arm accuracy, and was still, even with him aging a little bit, was still 89th percentile in pure arm strength in the big leagues last year, and used to be even higher up on that list. He's still well above average in sprint speed, can still run well on the bases and out in the outfield. This is still, if you find the right role for him, a productive player. But there's a reason why the best deal he could get is 1 year, $4 million for a team that's not going to let him be a starting outfield. There are some flaws in Ramón Laureano. We'll break down what they are coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Now, here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least two players' projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game, where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard for you to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you are cashing out. So whether you want it to be Saquon Barkley, more rushing yards, Jalen Hurts, less passing yards, Philadelphia Eagles, more tush pushes when they false start every single time. You could do most of that over at Prize Picks. And you can check out the promos tab. They've got some awesome deals. You can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So we talked about the good stuff Ramón Laureano has to offer as the Orioles have brought him in on a 1-year, $4 million deal that they announced on Tuesday. Now let's talk about the flaws in his game. Why he is only a guy at this point who is getting a 1-year, $4 million deal, despite how good he was in Atlanta last season. First of all, this was really only a partial season of good play. Like, yes, by the time he got to the Braves, he was closer to an everyday player, but it's still only 226 big league plate appearances last year. That is less than half of a full season for an everyday player. And again, I mentioned how good he was against lefties. That was only 66 total plate appearances with the Braves. Not a very big sample size. 92 WRC plus is what he had against righties. You see more of those guys. That's less than league average. That's not as good. And remember, I mentioned he was unplayable. Like one of the worst hitters in baseball in those 31 games with the Guardians last year before they released him and the Braves picked him up. So we're not that far removed from him being quite terrible. It could be one of those change of scenery guys like Aaron Hicks, where it kind of works out for 1 year. And then the next year he signed with the Angels and did nothing and was released. And yeah, not so much. That is certainly a worry. And it's coming off two pretty bad seasons in 2022 and 2023 with Oakland and Cleveland. Like he was at best a league average hitter between those 2 years with the defense falling off a bit. And some of that success he had last year was certainly BABIP driven. BABIP batting average on balls in play averages out around 270-ish for big league hitters. When you start to get a BABIP well over 300, that means you're getting a lot of luck when you're putting the ball in play. Balls are falling in that really shouldn't. And Laureano had a 350 BABIP for the full year, had a 380 BABIP in those 67 games with the Braves. That means there's a lot of luck involved. Now, again, it's not all luck. I mentioned he had the good barrel rates, right? He had a good sweet spots percentage. He's got good bat speed. But there was certainly some luck involved that makes it hard to think he can repeat this in 2025. Like you look at the oopsie projections at Fangraphs. That is the projection system that includes a lot of StatCast data. It's projecting him for 370 plate appearances and a 102 WRC plus. Basically, every projection system that Fangraphs has him being right around a league average hitter, not the guy who was 30% better than league average with the Atlanta Braves last season. Everybody expects that he's going to take a step back because that's more of the hitter he is at this point in his career. And you look at his total stats. I mentioned the BABIP. Like, although he hit overall on the season pretty well at 259, he had 250 or 235 expected batting average. And you also look at the strikeout to walk. He got his strikeouts down with Atlanta, but they were still at 28.3%. That goes along with a minuscule 3.5% walk rate. And this is a guy who used to draw walks like back in the day with Oakland, 9, 10 plus percent walk rates. Those are really good. 3.5% with Atlanta versus a 28% strikeout rate. It is not sustainable to be a productive hitter and run those kind of strikeout to walk numbers throughout a season. 45% swing and miss rate against breaking balls last year. That is a concerning number. There are some things under the table that worry you. And as I mentioned already, yes, the arm strength is elite. It's incredible to watch, but it somewhat makes up for some subpar overall defense in the field. He had a -6 outs above average in the outfield that combines all three positions via StatCast in 2024. Now, yeah, he can play all three positions and still be okay out there. And he was at a 0 outs above average in 2023, but also -5 in 2022. Like at his best, he's been a league average defensive outfielder. At his worst, he's been in the bottom 10 percentile in Major League Baseball like he was last year. Now, defensive runs saved, which is a separate defensive stat, has actually liked Laureano a whole lot more throughout his career and even recently. But most people prefer outs above average at this point because it is StatCast based and it has a lot more precise data rather than defensive runs saved. So I tend to go to outs above average. And when that's telling you it's a little rough, that probably means it can be a little rough out there. And he has had some bad defensive gaffes in his career in some big moments. Not saying it happens all the time, but it's come up in some big moments. His arm can kind of save him sometimes. Like he doesn't have the range or the ability to cut off a ball early enough in the gap to hold a guy to a single instead of a double. What he will do is pick it up and you'll go for second and he'll make an incredible throw you've never seen before to throw you out at second base. That's cool, but it's not as sustainable as just being good enough to cut the ball off anyway and mostly keep guys to a single because you're not always going to have the chance to use your arm. You use a lot more of your skills and tools in the outfield more regularly. Now, you can spin this. Like, he was not an everyday player for the Braves, but they relied on him a good amount because they brought him in with the injuries and he played a solid chunk. Yes, there are those concerns, but at this point in his career, and especially with the Orioles bringing him in for 1 year, $4 million, and what the Orioles already have in their outfield with Cowser and Mullins and O'Neill and Heston Kjerstad, like, they are not bringing in Ramón Laureano to be an everyday player. The Orioles are bringing in Laureano to be a platoon guy, to crush lefties, to play the outfield a little bit, to play a smaller role. If he's a role player, maybe he can still have a better chance at sustaining some of these things he was doing well. So that is the question. If he is a role player, what exactly will that role be in Baltimore? Try to answer that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time. Now, attending NFL playoff games, really any playoff games, it's an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. I was at game one of the wild card series, Orioles-Royals. The Orioles did not score a run. They lost that game, and it was still such a memorable moment at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And I'm looking forward to making new memories this season, and Game Time allows me to do that. They've got a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, I recently used Game Time Picks when I was looking at Ravens, Steelers tickets in the NFL playoffs. Browsing through the deals was simple. I found great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. And the super deal is pretty impressive. It offers the best value for the event every single time. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we finish up by trying to answer the question, what's Ramón Laureano doing here? Right? The Orioles have already brought in Daz Cameron this offseason to maybe be that fifth outfielder. Then a couple of weeks ago, the Orioles signed Dylan Carlson to a one-year deal, kind of a bounce-back candidate at age 26. We talked about how he does have minor league options, so could end up in AAA for a while, but certainly a guy competing for a fifth outfield spot who hits lefties well. And now they add Ramón Laureano to this mix as well. I really think first and foremost, in terms of his fit with the Orioles are setting up an old-school spring training battle. Like, they're going to throw Daz Cameron and Ramón Laureano and Dylan Carlson and maybe a guy like Jorge Mateo, if he's healthy, out there and just say, all right, all of you are fringe outfield options who hit lefties well. We have a spot for one of you on this opening day roster. Impress me. Now, right now, I would give Ramón Laureano the edge to win that spot because he just has a better major league track record and fits the roster, I think, the best out of all of these guys. And the Orioles just continue to add depth. That is what they have done this offseason. Have they made the giant splash move? No, they have not. And hopefully it still comes later this offseason via trade. But they have raised the floor of this team. They don't want to get into a point that they got to late last season where they ran out of depth and ran out of guys to use. Like, they have so much position player depth, so many guys who can hit left-handed pitching. And Tyler O'Neill isn't going to play every single day, but he's going to be more of an everyday player. He's somewhat the solution, the replacement for Anthony Santander. And the O's were still kind of looking for that lefty masher to fill a lesser role in the outfield. And that's why they brought in Daz Cameron. And that's why they brought in Dylan Carlson. But Laureano's just the better player than those two right now. And when the O's did sign Dylan Carlson, I talked about how it might put Jorge Mateo on the hot seat in terms of his roster spot. But what I think now that they've also added Laureano, I think this confirms Jorge Mateo is going to be on the injured list to start this year. He got that elbow surgery in August. The timeline is a little rusty. Mike Elias has said he's going to be involved in spring training in some way, so on the field, but you just don't know how delayed he'll be. In my experience, when the Orioles talk about that already, it means the guy probably won't be ready for opening day. I think at this point, it's not confirmed, but it seems pretty likely Jorge Mateo is going to begin the year on the injured list. That's what it feels like with all these additions. The Orioles are trying to find a fringe depth guy to fill that role for a month or so, or however long it takes. And again, Cameron could have done it. Carlson could have done it. I think Laureano can do it better than either of those guys. And that's, again, why it's not the most exciting, most sexy signing that a lot of the Orioles moves this offseason have. but it upgrades their roster. If they're not going to be without Mateo, there's an opening there. And I get you could say, oh, why don't you just give it to Kobe Mayo? Because he's not really projected on the opening day roster right now. But I do feel like it needs to be more of an outfielder the way the roster is set up, and Kobe Mayo is just not doing that right now. So a more veteran outfielder, I think, fits it better to get those. And you want Kobe Mayo getting regular at bat. That spot on the roster is not going to play too much. Makes more sense to bring in a veteran guy like Laureano. Like Mateo may have been somewhat of a right-handed hitting outfield option. The O's already have a lot of infielders, especially if Jackson Holliday is going to be on the opening day roster. Mateo was tried in the outfield last year, but Laureano just has more MLB experience, better at hitting lefties than the others, and I think kind of fills that role. So most likely, Daz Cameron would be DFA'd before the season began, and because Dylan Carlson has options, I don't think it matters that the Orioles signed him to a major league deal. I think that was just a way to get him to Baltimore. He's probably going to begin the year in AAA Norfolk, and the Orioles see Carlson as more of a prospect to kind of rebuild his value after a couple of really tough years in St. Louis and Tampa Bay. They're going to work with him and try and fix him in AAA Norfolk early in the year, and then maybe get to the All-Star break and kind of see where they are with Carlson. And if, Laureano continues to hit lefties like he did in Atlanta and turns out to be a really, really important platoon player, you keep him all year. Maybe you even consider picking up that $6.5 million club option for 2026. Probably not likely, but you at least consider it. Adding that to the deal is more of a reason to get him to sign. It just gives him the opportunity, the chance to think it's a multi-year deal when it really isn't. But if he's not good, it's 1 year, $4 million. Like with David Rubenstein in charge, I think that's been the biggest change so far to the payroll, besides the fact that the Orioles have added almost $60 million to their payroll this offseason. It's that Rubenstein says, yeah, if you want to bring in a guy for 1 year, less than $10 million, like that's nothing. You can bring in as many guys that as you want. If you DFA him, like it doesn't matter. It's not going to put us underwater like John Angelos used to claim it was. For 1 year's $4 million, you're not really committing that much to a guy. And if he's really bad and you have to DFA him in May or June, it's not really hurting you financially at all. And that's the nice kind of safe floor that David Rubenstein has given the Orioles so far. As the owner, it improves the depth that the Orioles did not have in the position player sense at the end of last season. And there are a couple other things that it could mean for the Orioles roster. It could mean that we're pretty much confirmed that Cedric Mullins is not going to play against left-handed pitching. We talked about it on last week's episode on Wednesday when I did the Cedric Mullins 2024 season review and kind of talked about, okay, what is his role going into his contract year this year with the O's? And I mentioned just how bad Mullins was against left-handed pitching last season and why it means even before this Laureano move that Mullins mostly wouldn't be starting against lefties. He really didn't do it down the stretch last year. I think you bring in Laureano. I mean, even after bringing in Carlson, I was thinking maybe this doesn't happen. But now you sign Tyler O'Neill and Ramón Laureano, and I think the Orioles put a lot of trust in Colton Cowser to stay out there and play every day. I think against lefties, you're going to see probably Laureano in left field, Cowser in center, and O'Neill in right. And then you'll have Mountcastle playing first. And yes, you would still maybe have DH open, but with lefties on the mound, that's probably when you'll get Gary Sanchez behind the plate and let Adley DH. That kind of fills up the DH spot, and it fills up your outfield against left-handed pitching and puts guys like O'Hearn and Kjerstad and Mullins all on the bench as more platoon guys. And then against righties, you're not going to play Laureano. You're going to have Mullins out there in center field every day. You're going to have Cowser moving over to left, and you'll have some combination of O'Neill and Kjerstad and Mountcastle and O'Hearn. 3 out of the 4 of them will play right field, first base, and DH, and the other one will kind of rotate in and out of the lineup. That's kind of how I see the Orioles doing it at this point. Now, you may think, Connor, this is just, even though Laureano is not going to get a large chunk of playing time, he's going to be a platoon player, and when you're a righty, you have the small side of the platoon because you're only facing lefties. There are way fewer left-handed pitchers than there are right-handed pitchers in Major League Baseball, so you just play less than the other side of your platoon. So even if it is a Laureano Mullins platoon or Laureano Kjerstad Mullins, whatever it may be, the lefties in Mullins and Kjerstad will play much more than Laureano will. So it's not exactly stealing away a lot of playing time, but you might be thinking like, this is a lot of outfielders, and you still haven't found a way to fit Kobe Mayo into this team at all. And I hope he gets some serious at-bats for the Orioles in 2025. I'm not saying this means a trade is coming, just like I wasn't saying when the Orioles signed Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton that it meant a trade was coming. I just think that all 3 of those moves, and that includes now Ramón Laureano as well, makes it easier from a depth perspective for the Orioles to make a trade still for a top flight starting pitcher. Because with signing Sugano and Morton, you gave yourself the ability to include a Dean Kramer or a Cade Povich or maybe an Albert Suarez in a deal for a starter, you would still have the ability with Sugano and Morton as number 4 and 5 guys to backfill that rotation if, like the Padres for Dylan Cease or Michael King, wanted a young starter in that package. On the flip side, with Laureano and adding even Dylan Carlson, you can, to a lesser extent, throw into this conversation, allows the Orioles to, if a team really, really wants Heston Kjerstad in a deal for the Orioles to go get a top of the rotation starter, and they really want a young outfielder, it allows you to trade Heston Kjerstad in that deal. And it's going to hurt the Orioles. They like Kjerstad, but it allows you to trade him. And in doing so, you still have an outfield of Mullins, Cowser, and O'Neill against righties. And you still feel pretty good about that. And then against lefties, you can still throw out there the Laureano, Cowser, O'Neill outfield. And you can then have Mullins kind of roaming around, and you would still have a guy like Dylan Carlson, who I'd feel totally fine if he was just the Orioles' 5th outfielder coming off the bench instead of in AAA. You now have that depth to not lose a lot in your lineup. You lose a bit with Kjerstad, but you offset that and even more with adding a top flight starter and still have the ability to make a trade like that. Again, not saying this is pointing much closer towards a trade. It just makes it easier to make that deal. If it does come up for the Orioles at some point in this offseason, there is still time to make that move. Luis Vazquez, will never forget his era with the Orioles. I talked about him on Monday's episode. Make sure to check that one out. Like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and a review, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. Luis Vazquez was DFA'd by the Orioles to make room for Laureano on the 40-man roster. He will now go on waivers, along with Emmanuel Rivera, who is there as well. And we'll continue to watch and see if they will stick in the O's organization. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so, so much for tuning in. Let me know here in the YouTube comments, what do you think Ramón Laureano's role will be 2025? And do you think he has a legitimate spot now with the Orioles? We will be back tomorrow for one more episode this week. We're going to take a look at Keegan Aiken's 2024 season and try to figure out, how was he so good out of the Oriole bullpen last year? And what does that mean for his role heading into 2025? Also a reminder, planning to potentially do a Locked On Orioles listener fantasy baseball league this year. If you have interest in that, please shoot me an email, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, kind of gathering interest for that fantasy league now. But we will be back tomorrow talking Keegan Aiken on the show. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.